Today, our speaker comes from Secular Coalition. His name is Joe Blankenship. So Joe has been a member of the Secular Coalition for Arizona and Secular Communities, which is the 501c3 affiliate of Secular Coalition, and he's been with them for nearly 3 years. He has had a successful career as a business professional and responsibilities for strategic planning for 2 Fortune 500 companies, and was a CFO of a subsidiary of one of the Fortune 500 companies. And he's also the president and CEO of a public company. He was also president and CEO. I think you're retired now, right?
Right.
Yeah, he's one of these busy retired people. But he was president and CEO of a public company that addressed recycling and recovery of household and commercial waste. With Secular Coalition, he's recruited speakers for the successful Secular Studies program presented for the Arizona Legislature. And this is a very special activity. Joe also writes on public policy issues and presents his conclusions to interested audiences. Certain topics of interest are quality education and separation of church and state. So let's welcome Joe Blankenship.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. I have a quick question for you. How many folks here have seen the movie On the Basis of Sex about Ruth Bader Ginsburg? So, a few. Well, there's a certain scene in there where she's presenting to a district court in Denver about a tax case, discrimination against men about taxes. Do we need to turn up the volume? Go away. The attorney for the government says to the judges, if you change this law, it will cause some very radical social change. Next comes Ruth Bader Ginsburg and says, Your Honors, no, she didn't say that. All right, we're at radical social change. Ginsburg says, Your Honors, may it please the court, radical social change has already happened. What is not kept pace is the tax law that brings us to this point. Well, basically, when I start talking about Project Blitz here, I'm going to, in effect, say that radical social change is what these Christian nationalists are fighting at and indicate where that may possibly go. Okay. See if we can get this up. All right. Last week's New York Times. We've got the beginning of the 22nd session of Arthur, a kid's show, been on for 22 years, and they're opening with a same-sex wedding. Now, I figure the New York Times did this so that they could say, up yours, Mike Pence, because this is the aggravating situation for him. But Project Blitz is not the first rodeo for trying to get Christian nationalism in the United States. This book from a Princeton professor goes back all the way to the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, as to what is happening to the evangelicals, and particularly during the 1930s, we had Roosevelt trying to enact lots of things to get us out of a recession or a depression, and it was really upsetting to the National Association of Manufacturers, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, saying unions, Social Security, health care for all, these are socialist programs, and we don't want America to be a socialist country. So they started making advertising about their own businesses, saying, we are here to do this, we make America go. And people looked at them and said, you're just blowing your own horn, and it really wasn't effective. So a lot of things were happening in the church environment, particularly evangelicals. They determined that the businesses would marry up and say, we will give you certain things if you will put some of the philosophy of what we're doing into your sermons. So at a point in time, there were 12 to 15,000 ministers in the U.S. who were getting propaganda from National Association of Manufacturers, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that says this is what Christianity is all about. It's about independence. It's about doing things of your own. It's about not having a socialist government. As we got into the 50s, it was talking about the godless communism and where we could, what's going to happen to America if we have that going here. Well, that was very successful in terms of getting particularly a lot of ministers introduced to legislators. And let's say President Eisenhower, when he came in 1952, he felt himself to be a very spiritual person. He was the first one who did a congressional or a national Christian conference breakfast and got that started, which still goes on. But even on his inauguration, there was a float going down the street said, "In God we trust." The integration was pretty pure in that in 1954, when Earl Warren was appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, all the ministers came in and prayed with him. And later on, Earl Warren was saying, America, or the United States, is a Christian nation. That happened to continue mostly through all the 60s. There was not a lot of opposition to it. The ACLU was fighting the communists and McCarthyism. There was only one organization like us, Americans United, but their biggest problem was making sure that you don't fund Catholic schools from the government. It wasn't until 1960 when a young man came along running for president named John F. Kennedy. Well, my God, Kennedy's a Catholic. He's going to have the Pope telling him what to do in terms of us. So between John F. Kennedy saying, I fervently believe in the separation of church and state, and appointing a lot of different people in terms of not only his cabinets, the excitement from the Christian nationalists began to go away. Other denominations also stepped up and said, well, we want things to be different in this realm as well. It wasn't until later, eventually we had Jimmy Carter, who was a good Christian as president, and all the meantime, this libertarian evangelical philosophy continued to where we had that migrating into what we now have as American Enterprise Institute, the Koch brothers, basically ALEC. And these were the kinds of things that they were preaching, and the church was preaching at the same time as well. Government does not have the right to coerce the individual beyond basic law. This was integrated into some of the Southern philosophy in terms of Brown versus Board of Education, where school integration was coming about. In other cases, it was the government is the realm of coercion in the market. In this particular case, religion is the realm of freedom. So the church and what came out to be the Koch brothers over time were married up in philosophy to a large degree as well. So what we have now in terms of Project Blitz, it started in 2015. We're in the third year, approaching the fourth year of that now, but it really wasn't heard of. They kept it very secret. When I had a program at the legislature for Democrats in January of this year, none of the Democrats knew that Project Blitz even existed. It was new to them. All the while, last year, there was bills being produced by some of the Republican legislators that were basically coming out of Project Blitz. They say in their playbook, this is the evangelical Christians' version of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. Centrally manufactured legislation for a religious agenda. This is the front cover. It's a report and analysis of religious freedom measures impacting prayer and faith in America. It's 148 pages. There's 28 different proposed legislation, proclamations, talking points, notes through that playbook. And in 2017, 2018, nearly 200 bills and resolutions introduced in 41 states, about 60 adopted. Last year in Arizona, we had a bill which we at Secular Coalition opposed that said, let's take the Arizona motto and seal, Dietas Deis, the Latin, say we bring that up into God enriches, the English, and God enriches should be wherever the state seal is up. We should have, let it keep Dietat Deus, but underneath it put God enriches. This is the kind of thing that begins to say that we now begin to introduce other bills that are a little more insidious and do different things. So what is their goal? They don't hide it under a rock. They say, have Christian disciples in every government job, from dog catcher, mayor, state representative, governor, and the president. Well, we got the vice now, and the president will do anything that he says, because as long as he's doing that, he's keeping the evangelical group as voters for him. Declare this a Christian nation and be ruled by a Christian theocracy. Their stated goals. This is the pattern of what they will look at to what we do. Educate the nation. Its laws and policies were firmly rooted in biblical principles. They're trying to do that. Sometimes they don't tell the truth about it, but they give the biblical principles, and what the founding fathers say, they just mitigate a little bit of the truth around what the founding fathers really said. Providing information. Well, that's the playbook and any kind of legal and help defense in terms of getting bills introduced. Providing direct assistance to elected and appointed officials. Encouraging Christians, people of faith, to become involved in the civic arena. They've been very effective of this. Governor of Kansas, Rick Santorum, Mike Huckabee. You go on, and right now in the cabinet of Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo and his the national representative for him. Basically, wherever they go, they're proposing the Christian philosophy. Their basic philosopher and educator is a guy by the name of David Barton. He's a self-anointed historian who professes that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, absolutely, and the founders really never intended for the separation of church and state. Hey, the Constitution doesn't say separation of church and state. It just says you shouldn't have a religion there. They also have some very effective legal offense and defense. The National Legal Foundation is a part of Project Blitz supporters, and there's a group in Phoenix called the Alliance Defending Freedom. They have 500 lawyers under call that says whenever somebody has a problem, we're going to help you to defend or to keep from somebody keeping it out of the law. Religious liberties measures for states. Legislation regarding our country's religious heritage. This is just making some of the propositions or proposals, resolutions and proclamations on religious history. And then the final part is where we get to the laws of saying religious freedom and how you can act in that. Some 28 measures overall that are in the playbook, in the Republicans' hands, saying these are bills that you can introduce and what we help on them. And just recently, this was a tweet by President Trump right after his State of the Union message saying, numerous states introducing Bible literacy classes, giving students the option of studying the Bible, starting to make a great turn. Last week, or the week before, the Washington Post gives this: a conservative Christian group is pushing Bible classes in public schools nationwide, and it's working. At least 10 state legislators introduced versions of Bible literacy classes in school this year. Well, 10 didn't get passed, but 2 did. But that's just hanging on to what has been out there for a long time, which is in the elementary schools. There's about 6,000 elementary schools that have what we call the Good News Club. The Good News Club is where they set up an after-school program. The kids are invited in to play, to learn, and there's always a little bit of Bible and Christian philosophy going through that. The Supreme Court has said as long as it's optional, they choose to do it, and you aren't forcing anybody in there, it can be done, and it can be done on school property. A part of this that we're running into, and again, very recent, can doctors refuse to treat a patient? The Trump administration says they may, if the treatment would violate their religious views. Well, we're seeing a lot of that nowadays. This is out of an Americans United brochure about a month ago. What is happening in some senses, the allowing of a taxpayer-funded foster care and adoption agency to turn away prospective parents who are LGBTQ or are of the wrong religion. A case in South Carolina right now is that, again, a state-appointed agency, a woman comes in to adopt a child. The agency says, "What religion are you?" She says, "Catholic." Well, we only want children to be adopted into good religious Christian homes. That case is being handled by the ACLU, and it's basically in the courts right now. Obstructing access to health care, particularly for women and transgender people. We'll get a little more of that. The insidious part comes to where allowing state employees, corporations, individuals, healthcare providers nonprofit organizations to use religion as a justification to discriminate. Last fall, about October, November, in Phoenix, there were 2 cases where people take a prescription to a drugstore, and in one case, a woman refuses to fill the prescription, takes it away, and will not give it back so that the person could take it to either another one or give it to another pharmacist there at the program, at the store. The second case was another drugstore that got almost the same situation, except somebody just handed it over to another pharmacist to fill because it was against their religious belief. In both cases, something was done. The first pharmacist was fired. The second pharmacist, a different store, a different company, got their folks together and said, here is the policy, that we will not discriminate in filling pharmacy requests like this. And if you choose that it is against your religion, you may go work someplace else. So in those cases, it was, let's say, moderated in that way. Now, when I talked about this radical social change, and I started looking at this and what they're trying to do, and how does that fit with the current cultural mode of what's happening in America and what people think about it, how they're living their lives. America's cultural reality. Take 2 policy resolutions, or 3 here, that are from the book. A resolution establishing public policy favoring intimate sexual relations only between married heterosexual couples. No same-sex marriage, no intimate sexual relations, none if you're single, anything like that. A resolution establishing public policy favoring reliance on maintenance of birth gender. A resolution establishing public policy favoring adoption by intact heterosexual married-based families. Well, where are we as a society in acceptance of this and how we're viewing it? In terms of morality, the latest poll that I could find said something about modern morals was 2016. Married people having an affair, a lot of people are, feel that's wrong. Having an abortion, the statistics say that 64 to 69% of the people favor Roe v. Wade staying in place, that some say it's not even a moral issue. Homosexual behavior, this is very much moved to the fore where people will accept that that may not be a choice, but rather is a physical condition. Sex between unmarried adults, most say it's morally acceptable and not a moral issue. Living together before marriage, this is a big issue. 73% say it's none of your business. The reason people say, or the reason people look at are gay people, is this a nurture or nature? Are they choosing to do this, or is it a condition? The American Psychological Association says that little or no sense of choice seems to be available for people who are wondering about their sexual orientation. Americans' approval of same-sex marriage, 67% approve, only 32% disapprove. This is what Project Blitz is fighting, if you will, not overtly, but in terms of the attitudes of people. Recent large study by the New York Times in March of Generation Z, people going from 18 to 30, next is the millennials on that side, say We have the tools and language to understand identity in ways that our parents really never thought of. This group says 89% of them say it's up to an individual to determine their personal identity. It's not up to the church. Attitude on Roe v. Wade, at least 64% in July of 2018. Now that number is a little bit higher. Unaffiliated, the people who do not have an affiliation with a religious institution, 89% of them say we want Roe v. Wade to continue. Cultural aspects of what is happening. Adults over 18 years old to old, in 2016, only 50% of the adults in America were married. That was a startling statistic to me, knowing only married people for a long, long time, but 72% in 1960. If you go back a little bit more, it was as high as 85%, sometime in the 50s, of people being married, and the unmarried statistics were much lower. U.S. births to unwed mothers. 40% of children born in 2014 were to unmarried mothers, against 20% in 1984. There's a whole lot of conditions that come into play there. The Me Too movement, the women, more educated women than men, who eventually say, well, if I didn't find the right partner, I want to have a family anyway, I will go ahead and have a baby. In some cases, for the black population, 72% of the births in 2014 were to single mothers. To me, that's saying that not only a lot of that is societal structured because the men are in jail or in prison, but what's going to happen to those children? How are we going to affect what the society looks like when single mothers and single fathers are raising the children? Somebody come out and said, well, life begins at conception, but it ends with birth. Because at this juncture, we're so involved with getting to the birth of the child, but very little attention to what happens to the child after that. Children in households with unmarried parents, 16.7 million households against 4.2 million in 1968. These are unmarried women, unmarried men. Many times it can be both in the same family, in the same household, with an unmarried man and an unmarried woman co-parenting. 73% of men and women, we've covered this before, say living together before marriage is not a moral issue. It's even happening in the cyborg world. He's asking, is it true you married a human woman and gave birth to a cyborg? And married a human? No, that's ridiculous. We're just co-parenting. Please get around. So what is the language when it comes to discrimination on the basis of a sincerely held religious belief? This is in the original federal legislation, 1993. Well, after they determined that that was federal legislation not impacting the states, 26 states have now have Religious Freedom Acts, and all of them say the same language, that you have the right to act in a manner that is substantially motivated by sincerely held religious belief, that you can speak, act and refuse to speak or act based on this sincerely held religious belief. But even in the federal legislation, any of the state legislation, no one has ever tried to define what is the sincerely held religious belief. That's for the individual to determine. You can be a Satanist, you can be an atheist, you can be a Scientologist, you can be a Christian. It doesn't matter. Whatever you believe personally, individually, you can act on this. So this could be the basis of where we have a very discriminatory type situation. Here in Arizona, a current case before the Arizona Supreme Court says it's a brush and nib. You've probably heard of this. It was brought against the city of Phoenix. These folks aren't even in business yet, but the Alliance Defending Freedom said, well, if you believe that, we want to take and test it to make sure that you can do what you want. Can a business owner refuse to design a wedding invitation for a gay couple? We've got the cake issue in Colorado, somewhat been adjudicated rather nominally, if it goes against your serious, sincerely held religious belief. Well, the city of Phoenix, in this particular case, when the original case was brought, they said the government can interfere if it has a compelling interest. Again, this is part of the language of both the national and all the state Religious Freedom Acts. If the state has a compelling interest, they can override what somebody says about a sincerely held religious belief. The city of Phoenix says, we have found that eliminating discrimination constitutes a compelling interest. So in this particular case, the city of Phoenix said, well, if you choose to do this, you can't do business in Phoenix. It's been adjudicated all the way up to the Arizona Supreme Court, and we're awaiting the judgment on that. I looked at a lot of the testimonial that went on in terms of what questions the judges were asking, the responses, things like that. So this should come down as a verdict in the next 60 to 90 days. It has been adjudicated in the lower court, giving Phoenix the right to continue with this kind of attitude or law saying you just can't discriminate. This is Trump's State of the Union message. And in getting near the part of it, he started talking about a instance in New York recently where there was a discussion that a mother could go to full term and under certain circumstances, even almost at full term, abort the baby. Well, Trump has taken it a little bit further. You can rip the baby from the womb. You can wait until after it's born and the mother and the doctor can decide whether they want it to live or not. He's really made a case out of this. But in this particular case, he was talking about it at his State of the Union message. He gets to where he says, now, are we going to allow that to happen, post-birth abortion? And he turns around and looks at Mr. Pence, who's sitting on the up behind him, and kind of looks at Mr. Pence and said, that's for you, Mike. He didn't say it, but that was the indication. In the audience, two of our recent appointees to the Supreme Court, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, the important part of this is that in both of them, the questioning of what are you going to do about Roe v. Wade, they were taught, both of them, very well. The same thing would come out. Roe v. Wade is the established law. Well, would you reverse Roe v. Wade? Roe v. Wade is the established law. No indication whether they would keep the law or override it. It was Roe v. Wade is the established law. We still will not have something on this, probably during this term of the court. I'm looking for 2020, where the radical abortion laws in some of the states now get to the court in that time, and we may have an answer to that question. In my view, we're looking to John Roberts, who, as Chief Justice and as his court, what attitude he may take to say, in my court, I'm going to keep the precedent of Roe v. Wade, or I'm going to let it be overturned. A part of the playbook at this time was the first time they were telling legislators and people about talking points to counter anti-religious freedom legislation. If somebody wants to expand the sexual orientation and have a civil rights category for that, if they want to counter adding gender identity and have a civil rights category for that. Well, just recently, we have three different cases that have been accepted by the U.S. Supreme Court that says, does the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, apply to, well, it applies to all of these, including sex. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission says yes. We've got all of this history going from 1964 to now, and we've just assumed that it does. But the Trump administration says no. The act cannot fairly be read to apply to discrimination based on sexual orientation or transgender status. Now, again, our Alliance Defending Freedom is playing an active role in that, whether they instituted the cases or not, but they're certainly defending all three cases before the Supreme Court to try to make sure that this does not happen. But while this is going on, Congress has tried to do something about it. Because 30 states have no anti-discrimination protection for LGBTQ people, what are we going to do about it? In the House of Representatives, a bill was introduced saying we're going to cover these instances of probable discrimination and say that they would be covered under either Title VII or this particular law. This law passed this past Friday in the House of Representatives. Next, it will go to the Senate. We don't know what will happen at the Senate. I have my thoughts, but I know that if it gets to the president, he's going to veto it. So, again, we'll be looking for the Supreme Court cases to say either this will mitigate the Supreme Court cases, or if this bill does not make it all the way through, we'll be looking for the Supreme Court to say, can you discriminate based on transgender or LGBTQ? Now, the interesting part of this is that if we look at where we are as a society and what do people think about this, this is probably less than a month old. Majorities in every state across the country favor non-discrimination protections for LGBT people. Nobody, I won't say nobody, most of the people in America favor identity to be up to the individual. If we look at Arizona, 68% of the people say they want that. I even go over to Alabama, 59%. The lowest number in here is Arkansas at 56. But a majority of the people do not want this kind of discrimination going on. So we've got to say with Project Blitz, is this a religion or is it a political party? 81% of the evangelicals voted for Trump. They are his key policy line that he's going to do everything he can to play to them for the 2020 election. Value Voters Summit of one of the organizations supporting Project Blitz, they'll have a conference call for ministers across the U.S. telling them where they think they should be voting on or preaching to their congregations on certain issues, or in some cases, certain candidates. Well, that's against the Johnson, you start talking candidates, that's against the Johnson Amendment, but we have two legal firms there who says they will defend them if they choose to do that. The number one thing anyone can give us is the Supreme Christ, but the second best thing that can give this generation is the Supreme Court. At this point, they're there. 4 on the liberal side, 4 on the conservative side, and the guy in the middle. How is he going to vote? Family Research Council organization spent $18 million in the 2016 election for candidates. They're going to spend a lot more money in the 2020 election than they did then. And they've made that clear. So if you're looking at religion, who do you trust? Americans trust in religious leaders. Only 13% will say a great deal. 39% say a fair amount. Close to 50% say no trust at all or very little. This is enhanced by a recent scandal in the Southern Baptist Church, where all of a sudden 700 ministers were accused of some kind of aberrant behavior against women. When are we going to get to where those folks with no religion exceed the number of the religious side? Well, if we take denomination, evangelicals, this was just this past month, this poll came out. Right now, the non-affiliated population in total will exceed both the number of evangelical Christians and the number of Catholics as a denomination. But the total still gives them 46% against 23%. And they vote a lot more consistently and a lot more heavily than the non-religious, the non-affiliated people do. The millennials, somewhere in the 30 to 40% of those will vote. The Generation Z had a higher count in the 2016 election. But until we got those folks voting in a greater number against what other folks are doing on the Catholic. Now, all of these, for the most part, are voting on the liberal side. So how is the voting going to change so that Project Blitz is not an issue? Because the society says it's not an issue that we want to have. And again, here is a 2016 poll in terms of saying Generation Z, the 18 to 29, they're saying 39% of them are religiously unaffiliated. This 29% is the millennial population, and we'll go to the great and the old folks out here, which is some of us who are not religious affiliated at a very low part of the population. So what are we trying to do? What do we want to do? What do we have to do to make this change? Secular Communities for Arizona, I'm the principal guy who's doing the policy papers and the speaking at this point. We're trying to enhance that and make it bigger, but encourage the adoption of anti-discrimination laws. If the Equality Act were to work, it basically solves this. But otherwise, how can we get laws like the City of Phoenix, ordinances that says they will not stand for discrimination in their territories? Work with legislators in every state to introduce legislation. Well, we have the Christians, an ALEC on the corporation side. We have very few people at the side of the non-religious or unaffiliated at state legislatures. Secular Coalition for Arizona is the only chapter of Secular Coalition for America that has a lobbyist and does what we do with the Arizona Legislature. AU, FFRF, no one else. They have national lobbyists, but no one else does what we do in Arizona to try to mitigate some of this program. Develop a curriculum and teaching program about the Constitution and Founding Fathers. This is something that I did a crowdfunding raise in March and April. Didn't turn out as well as I would hope, but we're going to go ahead with a program where we are going to be talking to all of the schools that we can and the state education department to get more civics education into schools. Civics knowledge in our whole population is abhorrently bad. Take our message to every legislative district in the state. If we can work through the national organizations to take this message or other messages about Project Blitz, we will do that. A local speakers bureau. Some of our board members are being trained to do what I'm doing. I'm working on other policy papers. We will have other writers for policy papers. So far I've got one on education, Project Blitz, working on another called the manufacturing legislation that was talked about a little bit earlier. And working with other organizations, try to improve civic education and engagement. What's the citizen's role in a republic? How can we get you to vote? Know your candidate. Is the candidate working for you or is the candidate working for someone else? Elect candidates that work for the citizen. The role of government right now is to provide a free market for the corporations and to protect the people who are making the most money from paying any taxes. The Republicans, the corporations in a republic, are we going to accept that a corporation is a person? Supreme Court said so, but Supreme Court could reverse that too. What is the civic responsibility? When Boeing will tell their community in Washington and Seattle that unless you give us certain tax breaks, we will take the manufacturing of our new airplane to South Carolina, where we've got a facility down there. In 3 years, Boeing got $16 billion worth of tax credit or tax reductions out of state, local communities. Who's funding the schools? Who's funding the fire departments? Who's making the roads go? Boeing lives there. Well, they were only earning about 50% on the equity for their stockholders. The guy who was chairman at this time resigned a little bit later after this was settled. His pension said $276,000 a month that he would be paid. You would do well on that kind of pension, wouldn't you? Well, kind of trying to contradict some of this, we recently had the founding myth, why Christian nationalism is un-American. This was released May the 14th. I've read it all. It's basically saying what we're saying. The Christian nationalist myths, America is founding as a Christian nation. America was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. We know that that's not true and that's a myth, but Andrew Seidel here is giving you the case against it and against David Barton. An earlier one, Inventing a Christian America, this guy, Stephen Green, was counsel for Americans United for about 10 years. He helped to write the original federal legislation on religious freedom, the 1993 Act. This has somewhat of a better explanation if you're interested in that argument that Andrew Seidel is trying to make. And we will continue to do what we can do to write, to speak, and to affect the legislation going on in Arizona. Any questions?
Thank you, Joe. If anybody has any questions, please come up and use the mic so that we can record both the question and the response for the video when it's posted.
Thank you for the speech. Very enjoyable. I was just wondering, oh, is it on?
Okay.
What would actually happen if Roe versus Wade were overturned? What would actually happen? That's a law, but who would obey it?
We were in that situation a number of years ago when abortion was illegal in most of the United States. And the conditions were that you could have the coat hanger of abortion, you could go across to Mexico. Well, no, you couldn't go to Mexico because it wouldn't happen there. You'd have to go to Sweden or someplace like that. Poor people couldn't get an abortion, or at least a legitimate abortion. I don't know. My question is this: why would any woman vote for a Republican who's going to issue this kind of bill? It's going to have to be a legislative change if Roe v. Wade is overturned, because even people in the court say this should be a legislative agenda, not a judicial decision.
But would the court, as it's currently made up, follow that principle?
To me, it's 50-50. I say, where is John Roberts on this issue? Because he can determine that. We know how 4 and 4 is going to vote. As long as Ruth Bader Ginsburg is alive, at 88 or something like that, and she says she will live as long as Trump does, as he's president. So I can't answer that.
I heard somewhere that the religious right was praying for Ruth Bader Ginsburg to pass away, which is very upsetting. I just have a couple of comments as a thank you for speaking today. I'm so proud that Arizona has a lobbyist in Phoenix for the secular community. As a lifelong Democrat, I am really upset that Project Blitz has been around since 2015, and the Democrats in Phoenix found out about it last year. I feel like
this year.
For a lot of things, the Democrats have really been asleep at the wheel on
they
things
have.
like this. So that's really upsetting to me. The other thing that upsets me is that Trump signed a executive order in May of 2017 to restrict the Johnson Amendment. And then he said in the National Day of Prayer this month that he got rid of the Johnson Amendment, which he didn't. But his 81% evangelical followers believe that when he says that. So where's the uproar from the press or whoever saying, no, Johnson Amendment still applies. He didn't get rid of it, quote unquote, because he just says things like that, and unless you do some fact checking and are aware of it, it's just another thing he just puts out there that he's accomplished when he hasn't.
I'll go back to a slide that I had here. April 16th, 2019, a huge article in the Arizona Republic said, we're telling you for the first time that folks are out there giving you manufactured legislation. Now, as I said there, how stupid do they think we are? Because we know ALEC has dominated Republican legislators in this state for 20 years or more. If you're a Republican, you don't have to work for your citizen. You're getting your money from American Enterprise Institute, Betsy DeVos, the legal firm of Goldwater is writing all the bills on charter schools. They're actually going down and parking themselves in the Department of Education and doing these things that we've got the worst education system in America, even though it says that we're number 46 or something like that. And it's basically a money-making thing for people, and people in the legislature, but people to get rich on charter schools. So how do we live with that in Arizona?
Is the license plate thing, In God We Trust, is that part of Project Blitz?
No. That's a moneymaker for this law firm that I was telling you about, Alliance Defending Freedom. They put up the money to do that. And yes, we were objecting to it because the money is going there and it's defending all of this discrimination that is going on. But there's nothing we could do about it. What they say is, okay, yeah, we're going to get the money. We'll get $1 million a year. You can do the same thing. All you have to do is put up $30,000 to have it say what you want to say and do your own license plate holder. Department of Transportation will not stop it.
You just mentioned that there's money coming in to influence many of these issues, and in some cases the source of the money is known, but in other cases it's hard to find out what the source of the money is. Right now there's an initiative, a proposed constitutional amendment in Arizona that's being organized by Terry Goddard to make it compulsory that the source of money that is influential in politics be divulged. In other words, to prohibit secret source money. Is there any chance of a coalition between your secular communities and this somehow parallel enterprise, Stop Dirty Money?
If you'll recall, there was an initiative on that in the 2018 election. My wife was extremely active in generating signatures for that. They had more than enough in terms of what was said, but the Attorney General for the state said many of those signatures weren't valid, and therefore they didn't have enough to put it on the ballot. It's being circulated again. What kind of shenanigan will be in the way of getting it on the ballot again? Again, when you have a Republican-dominated legislator and the governor, whom we keep hoping would resign so that we'd get a Democratic governor as Secretary of State step in. But I'll go back to my question. Where are the voters in Arizona on some of these issues. It was public that Betsy DeVos funded Republican legislators in the 2016 election. She bragged about it on her website. She gave $278,000, just the Betsy DeVos. We know that Doug Ducey got $6 million out of American Enterprise Institute. We know because he shows up at all of their events and says thank you. Again, who do they vote for or who do they work for? And we as voters have to make that decision.
Just have one more. I was wondering what the current status of the Center for Arizona Policy are. I think that's called CAP. They influence the legislature on religious issues.
You're talking about Kathy Herod?
Yes.
Kathy Herod has more influence with the Republicans than anyone else as an individual. And she says she's got 5,000 churches that support her work there. It won't change until the legislature changes. Yes.
There has to be a large non-evangelical Christian religious bloc in the U.S. who might not be happy with what the evangelical Christians are suggesting also. And some of them are fairly well organized and fairly influential. And I'm just wondering how the politics works out with respect to the Mormons and to the Catholics. Are they in favor of this? And if not, what are they doing about it? It's not just us who are against it. It could be a lot of other Christians, too.
It should be a lot of other Christians. I've signed up with the Interfaith Movement. I haven't gotten active as yet, but they should be as much a part of the defense of this as we are as secularists, because I've gone to one major event, and there are 16 denominations there. And I didn't find one of the evangelicals among them. They themselves could represent a much larger population than just the evangelicals, but they have not been particularly political active. I want to take this message to them. It can be just like 1960 all over again, saying, hey guys, we got money in the game too, and we want to do something about this. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.